Dr. Rothman, thank you so much for joining the Easy Conversations today. I'm really excited, and it's fitting that we're talking during the month of Ramadan, but I've been extremely inspired by your work. I've had the opportunity to listen to your lectures and watch some of your videos. And what's really stood out to me, and I think that we talked about it here briefly before we jumped on the recording, is your pursuit of the truth, right? And we all tend to find our own version of it, especially in the world we live in today where there's so much information coming at us. And I would say majority of the times it's misinformation. But for you to go on this exploration that you went on and then eventually find Islam, I'm so curious to understand it. And I think the reason why I want to dive into that too is I have so many friends who have this misperception of Islam, and I find it frustrating at times because it is a misrepresentation based on what the media is telling us or how some people are behaving in the name of the religion. And I don't think any of us are willing to put ourselves in a situation where we fully embed ourselves in something and then have an opinion based on that. So with that being said, I do want to turn it over to you. And if you can tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, what are you doing right now? And then we can definitely jump into all of the things I've touched on.
Okay. It's good to be here with you. Thanks for the invitation. And yeah, I get this question asked a lot of like my journey and I know that it's a compelling story because I've been lots of different places and how did I wind up where I am? And I think if this question you ask of like who are you? What's your background? What are you about? And I find myself often most of the time in Muslim spaces and I'm speaking within to Muslim audiences, and I very much reference Islam all the time. And yet, my identity and my like way of describing myself would just be like a person, a human being that I'm a psychologist, and like I'm really fascinated in love with the human condition and like the notion of growth and consciousness and human evolution. And so that's really how I identify first and foremost is as a psychologist, but not in the way that most people think of that term when they hear psychology, because they think the mind or the brain and cognition. And for me, I've always understood psychology as the study of the psyche, which is the study of the soul. And so that really does define me by the meaning is like I feel like somebody who's deeply moved by and immersed in the study of the soul, both my own, primarily my own. At first, it was always just my own, but then in doing that, like I'm looking at studying the soul and trying to understand what is it about the humanity that makes us human. And I think that really is like who I am. It's how I see the world. It's everything underlying the things that I'm interested in from career to personal life is really defined by this identity as a soul, interested in studying the soul and really dedicated to trying to develop my soul and help other people develop their soul. And so that really does that is a good explanation of who I am and my background. And then the sort of like more straight, square answer to that career wise is yeah, I'm a psychologist. I got a master's in psychology. I was a therapist for 10 years before I went back and did a PhD in psychology. And so I have this whole like academic identity that for me doesn't really feel like who I am. It's what I fell into. But people see me through that lens of like academia and I don't know, referencing Islamic tradition and sources and then science of psychology. And like really that feels almost like a false identity for me. Like what I feel like more so is a seeker and somebody who likes to who tries to heal himself, but also does find myself and feels right to help other people heal.
Yeah, yeah, and I appreciate that, and it's so complex, and I do wanna come back to that whole notion of understanding the self because that is so prominent in Islam, and I think we lose sight of it too, especially in today's world. But I do wanna understand, like, was this interest always there for you? And if you're able to shed some light on what then motivated you to travel the world,
Mm.
where were you at in your own understanding of spirituality and what the purpose of human life is to compel you to then go on this search that you went on, if you're able to talk through that to a certain
Yeah.
extent?
I think what it was underlying at the core, it was about, it wasn't so much motivated by um, religious exploration. It wound up being religious exploration, but it was more almost like from a almost counterculture standpoint of there has to be more. This almost like a resistance to the oppressor or the man or the system, right? I had this very early on rebellious nature. And I didn't like the idea of buying into the mainstream. And so I was like alternative in many ways growing up. Like just always, always wanted to do something different than the rest of the kids were doing. And so that was the first thing. I was like, I was just, it came innovating or like trying to do my own thing. And as soon as other kids started doing something, I'd be like, I'm done with that. I need to do something else. And so there was this, let me try to break the mold. And through that, as I matured, it was more like, let me break through the facade of what this all seems to, what we're being told is important, or how we're being led to stay with the surface level material world. And I was like, there's something behind this. I relate very much to the movie The Matrix, and that notion of unplugging from the matrix and like having this thing in the back of your mind where you're like, no, something's not right, and that there's something more. That very much resonates with where this all motivated me. And it went through an evolution. It was always about there's something beyond, or there's something transcending what we experience in the normal, regular material life. And at first you can talk about that in a way that's just, oh, like counterculture, right? Or doing things against oppression or against the system. It can become this social change aspect. But if you really look at it all along, for me, what I was, and I think what most people is, they're sensing that there's some other dimension of reality. And that notion that there's another dimension of reality is a perception of the unseen,
Mm-hmm.
a perception that there is an unseen dimension of reality that is more than what we can see and measure and touch.
Right.
And so, as much as that may for me have not started out fully as like a spiritual quest, it pretty quickly morphed into that, which is why that going out into the world and seeking, it did wind up being like living with people of different religious traditions or spiritual faiths. But I would say the first step towards that wasn't necessarily motivated by this question of the soul and
Mm-hmm.
spirituality as much as it was of what do we what is the commonality of the human experience that could somehow answer these questions of what more is there than what we're being fed. And so I think part of that like veil or so much is about our identity, and that identity being wrapped up in culture, and like one and that same thing of we're from this place and we're of these people or we're of this race and we think this way and we do this and we dress this way. That fundamental attachment to this cultural identity becomes the veil to discovering who we really are, which is a soul which actually transcends all those cultural differences. And
Yes.
so my whole journey at first was like, I don't buy into this. I'm from this tribe.
Yeah.
Like, that's not who I am. I don't identify with that. I identify actually with these people over there. And I've read about these people in this other country, and that really resonates with me. And these people that do this ritual behavior is like, wow, that resonates with my soul. So there must be some connection there. And so that's what motivated me to travel the world and live with all these different people, is to break down the facade of the differences.
Yeah. Yeah. And I appreciate that. And I relate to so much of what you're sharing. And just to share my own experience, I didn't become a therapist till much later in life. I would say over the last 3 years. But initially, my career was in engineering because, again, that was what society told me and culture told me that's the path to go to be successful. And I always felt out of line because, to me, very much similar to what you're sharing, I felt like there's more. And until recently, I didn't really go on that exploration. And I think what drew me to psychology was very much similar to what you're sharing, is how do I understand myself? And the more I try study, the more it resonated for me and the more I decided to pursue this path. And it's funny, I recently rewatched The Matrix 2 a couple weeks ago with my son. And I first time I watched it, I was 16 and like 90% of it went over my head. And then watching it
Right.
again now as a grown man, it hits different. And I see
Yeah.
so much truth to it in terms of what you're talking about. Is once you lift that veil, it's hard to unsee what you've already seen. So it's very interesting. Now, how old were you when you went on this exploration? And I guess a follow-up question would be, did you see similarities between all these cultures you were immersing yourself in? Because I've unfortunately I haven't had the same experience as you to be able to immerse myself
Mm,
in it, but I've read about different spiritual practices, and at the root of it, it all comes down to the same thing, to me at
yeah.
least. But yeah, I just want to hear your experience with.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I, what was the first question, the first part of that question that you said?
Yeah, how old were you when you started
Oh,
that?
yeah. I think I was about 14 when I started, not necessarily when I started traveling abroad, but when I started looking out and being interested in other cultures and other ways. It happened pretty young. I would say 14. At that point, it was like through like music and counterculture, but also then reading a lot on other kind of ways of living and different paths. And then as I think I started traveling like within the US where I lived, pretty much once I could drive, I was like driving to different places, and I would oftentimes go and stay with like Native American tribes and find elders that I was like at age 16, pretty much literally as soon as I could be mobile. I was doing that within the bounds of my own country. And then as soon as I was able to travel abroad, like as soon as I turned 18, I traveled a lot with my family also. Even as a young child, we would travel a lot. And so that kind of was put in me within my family. And then when I did start traveling the world, it was immediately at 18. I would go and I would just live with people or stay with people. And the way I would travel was not, no plans. And it wasn't as a tourist. It was like with a small backpack, not even like a backpacker type thing. It was more just like a pack. And I would just show up places and see what happened. And I would usually live with people and not stay in hotels or hostels even. And so it was even at that age, it was different than what other people my age were doing and how they traveled. And I found that I would say in all the different communities that I lived with, the majority of the things that they're doing, whether it's lifestyle or beliefs or ritual, I would say a majority of it was in common with one another.
Mhm.
Probably 80% of everything that people are doing, including even like theology. And the 20%, within that 20%, there's the obvious things like, of course, people are going to eat different foods and wear different clothes and speak different languages, right? That's like an obvious surface level thing. But when it came down to even just the way they understand themselves in the world, what was at the core of how they find meaning or that they find meaning, and then the sort of theological frameworks with which they give answers to those questions of meaning, the differences for me wound up being so particular. They were like these specific things that I felt as somebody who was moving about fluidly within these places, it almost seemed inconsequential to me. It was
Mm.
like, oh, yeah, they do it this way. These other people do it that way. We're all really, we're talking about the same thing. And so I got to the point where it didn't even really phase me anymore, where I wasn't really caught up on those differences, because to me, it was just obvious that
Right.
we're just human and we're trying to make sense of the one human reality.
Yes.
And I believed from very early on in God. And so I believe we're all trying to make sense of the one God.
Mm.
Even in the faiths that we call polytheistic, usually you find a oneness within there. It's not
Yes.
really that much different than the monotheistic
Hmm.
traditions. Yeah, it was very easy for me to find the answer of we're all human and we're all under one heavens, and we have the same blood that runs through our veins, and we have a heart, and it's the soul, the structure of our being spiritually is the same fundamentally. There is no difference.
Mm.
And all the differences just became exciting and intriguing and beautiful,
Right.
because it almost completed the picture of, oh, you guys think of it this way. Yeah, that makes sense. Oh, you guys think of it this way. Yeah, that makes sense. Oh, and then it just filled out the package of decoding the human condition.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. And how was it received? Right. So you're this American kid wandering around different parts of the world. How were these cultures receiving you? Right. If someone just shows up randomly, hey, I just want to live with you guys
Yeah.
for a few days. Like, how is that being received by whether it was elders or members of those cultures or communities?
You know, what I found, what I can say upon retrospect, I don't know that I could have fully articulated this while it was happening, but there was really no reason for them to invite me in, because at face value, there's a lot of other people, white American Westerners, coming in and, hey, I want to have an experience or something. And their general thing would be like, not with animosity, but just like there wasn't like a huge open door, right?
Yeah.
But usually that's because the person is showing up in their identity as an American. And I think what I was doing, because I was so deeply entrenched in this process of the soul and getting to these core answers, is that I would show up with this open heart, open eyes, open mind, and I would come to them literally making them be able to feel almost immediately that I not only honored them, but felt like I could and wanted to learn from them, and
Mm.
that I had like full respect of their way of being. Like, I don't even know that I could do it that well now. I think at that time, something I unlocked in me. And also, when you travel, you break down a lot of things, especially when you travel without plans.
Yes.
You travel without plans and you don't even know where you're going to stay that night. And
Yeah.
you don't really have much on your back and you really have nothing to lose. It actually puts you in a position to have much more in common with because most of the people I was living with and staying with were like salt of the earth people. They didn't have much. And when you have nothing to lose.
Right.
And that's how their attitude was. But usually they're up against people who have something to lose.
Hmm.
And those people are walking around like that. Oh, maybe you're going to kill me. Maybe you're going to hurt me. Maybe you're going to steal my money.
Mm.
And I think because of the sort of exploration that I was doing on my own before traveling, I already had this base of letting go and unattachment, and you can't kill me because I'm an eternal soul. Like I
Yeah.
really fundamentally have
Right.
nothing to lose.
Yeah.
And so what that did is I showed up, and I fully showed up as a
Mm.
human being, and they saw that. Especially I was attracted to more like spiritual communities. And there was usually an elder who just was able to see that I was
Mm,
showing up in that way. And they were like, oh, you're welcome here.
yeah.
There's no pretense here. You're not putting up walls. Had I been putting up walls, they wouldn't have been as welcoming. It was
Mm,
because I put down these walls, and so what happened is, in every case, literally every case, not only did they invite me in, but they like were ready to give me their last name or change my tribe to their tribe, or like somehow do some sort of theological or ideological gymnastics to make me part of their bloodline, or whatever it is that made someone be able to be part of them.
yeah.
They were ready to have that be there. And so that really showed me that the commonality and what's underneath there is, if we can shed these identities and these layers of who we think we are and get down to the core of who we actually are, then all of the differences and the walls and the barriers just melt away.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, what I'm hearing from you is there was an aspect of humility there because you had nothing with you, right? You were open. And it sounds like you were also embodying a lot of the spiritual practices of letting go and not having that sense of
Yeah.
attachment, which perhaps even allowed you to transcend. I would assume there would have been language barriers. So how do you
Yeah. There was. Yeah.
navigate that? But to me, what I'm hearing from you is because you were able to get to that level of understanding and commonality with these people, that language was no longer a barrier.
That's true. That's right.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, I remember having a conversation, because this is in Germany, in Berlin, which I didn't spend that much time there, but I had a conversation with somebody was in a bar, and he didn't know English. He only knew German. I don't know any German. I only know English. And he was deaf. So he couldn't speak German either. So he literally had no language, but but the language that he understood in his psyche was German.
Mm.
And I spent a whole evening, maybe 4 hours, with this deep, intense conversation, drawing on napkins with gestures and eye contact, just communicating like on this deep level from the soul. And it really taught me a lot about, he was just so invested in communicating, and he knew he had these barriers to communication because he was living with that all the time.
Mm.
And it made me enter that world into like, how else can we communicate when we don't have the language that
Yeah.
we rely on to
Yes.
communicate. And so it's really about heart to heart. The only way you can really communicate heart to heart is if you are occupying your heart,
Yes.
if you're present in your heart. And I think that's what allows somebody to really be real with their humanity,
Hmm.
and allows for those kind of walls to come down, to really be able to have this transmission between two people happen that isn't reliant on cognitive understanding or even matching ideological frameworks.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I'm glad you touched on the heart because that is something we're going to come back to because it is relevant, at least for this conversation. Understand because from what I've been able to gather based on what you've shared in the past is Islam wasn't something that was on your radar. You accidentally stumbled upon it. And how long was this exploration of yours and what allowed you to stumble upon Islam?
Wow, that's a tough one to answer. I think the exploration was from age 14 to age 29 that I
Mm.
embraced. So we started about me doing this exploration in my teen years, and then I embraced Islam at age 29. And I think what allowed me to get there is this journey that I went on. Yeah, like you said, right? Islam wasn't on my radar.
Yeah.
And to be honest, religion really wasn't even on my radar. It was on my radar in the sense that I was fascinated by it and I was like always around it.
Mm.
But my kind of thinking was, look, everybody's practicing religions, and it's making people divided. And what is at the core of all these religions is humanity and unity and oneness. And so it just seemed like counterintuitive because religions seem to have one way, and I was looking for the way. And so I think what I came off of that journey, where I felt like I had gone to everywhere I could go, like
Yeah.
Buddhism, Hinduism, Rastafarianism, Gnostic Christianity, Judaism, like Unitarian, African spiritual traditions, Ifa, Yoruba, like I really dove deep into a lot of those, like spent time. And I think in every case, I felt like the majority made sense to me. The majority resonated. But then that 20% or whatever it was that made it different was like so specific. It was like, we only see the truth through this lens, and it has to be, and it's usually about some sort of like tribal affiliation.
Mm.
If you're one of us, or if you're saved, or if you believe in this, or you have this bloodline, or you have this skin color, or you have this. And I was like, okay, that just clearly doesn't make sense, because if it's about the soul, and the soul is about this eternal identity that's not attached to body, then if we're defining our identity as spiritual, as righteous people based on some sort of tribal affiliation, it just didn't make sense to me.
Mm.
And so I got to a point where I was like, I'm going to benefit from all of these traditions that I study, because each one of them has gems, like they really did.
Yeah.
And so I was like, I'll take the gems from all these different places and chart my own path. Like I wasn't gonna start my own religion or anything, but just find my own way. And then it was really at that point that I stumbled upon Islam through my study of psychology.
Mm.
Like it was through really looking for a healing tradition. So after that whole journey, I was like, what can I do in this world that would allow me to study the soul and really dive into this question of what does it mean to be human? How do we evolve as human beings and develop? And I was like, the career in the secular world is psychology,
Yeah.
just even in the name. And so I went back from my travels, like, okay, I've got to study this, and this is where I'm going to culminate all of this. And then in that, while I was doing my secular study of psychology, it just became very clear that like none of these theories really did it for me, because they didn't involve this transcendent spiritual tradition
Mm.
that had like deep wisdom from like beyond, which I found in all these other traditions. There was like wahi, that was like revelation.
Yes.
And I was like, okay, in order to ground my practice in psychology, I need to find a wisdom tradition that is informing my approach to the science of the soul. And in looking at all of the traditions and what they offer in this area, it just became very clear. Or I was introduced to Islam and ilm nafs, or the science of the soul,
Mm-hmm.
and it was like, whoa, this is it for healing. But as I dove down into what is possible in healing the human soul and the heart and the ruh, it became just like very clear that this was the culmination of all of those gems that I had collected from all these different traditions, and it was all contained in one.
Mm.
And it was the unification of it, because it was the obliteration of tribalism. There was absolutely nothing in it where you needed to be of this tribe or of this bloodline or of this people or of anything.
Mm-hmm.
Literally, you just recognize that you're already Muslim. Like, that's all it is.
Yeah.
And I was just, yes, this is it. This is the thing that I had been seeking. And it was the thing that I was finding in all these other traditions.
Mm-hmm.
It was just that this was the complete package.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was really beautiful in that where I was at, I don't think I would have been able to embrace Islam as a religion, but seeing it through healing, being introduced to it through healing, and as a not only pathway, but as like a system and a containment
Hmm.
for the methodological process of developing and evolving the human soul. It was just like, yeah, this is the science of humanity.
Yeah.
Like, this is the answer to all of those questions and that whole journey and that path. And so it was like very easy for me to not only say, okay, this is my path of psychology, Islamic psychology is it, but also fundamentally it was very easy to be like, I'm Muslim. Like, this
Hmm.
is the path. This
Yeah.
is the path for me.
Yes.
And what I struggle now with is I'm 100% Muslim. That's not a negotiable thing for me. And I can confidently say that it won't be.
Mhm.
And at the same time, I feel uncomfortable talking about Islam within religiosity terms, like in this like religion, because the people's notion of religion is very much defined by in-group, out-group dynamics. And so even Muslims who understand their religion and should understand that being Muslim is actually a state of being. And yet there's still this like orientation to it of, oh, you're either Muslim or you're not Muslim.
Mhm.
And those people are not Muslim and we are Muslim. And it's just us and them.
Right.
And I just feel like that's not what I signed up for. And that's not what I understand Islam to be. And yet I almost feel pressured to have to talk about it in that way. Otherwise, people will call me out as like a perennialist
Yeah.
or maybe not even Muslim. But like I'm really fundamentally just following what's in the Quran
Hmm.
and the way of the Prophet,
Yes.
Islam, which he invited everybody and never pressured anyone. And the whole Quran talks about la ikrah fi din, to each his own religion, and
Yes.
it's a way of being. It's a way of life. It's not. We've made it into a religion, but
Mhm.
it's not a religion in the sense of an organized religion that has some sort of infinite definitiveness that you're either in it or you're not. It's much more fluid in that I've met a lot of people who don't follow the religion of Islam who I would say are much more Muslim than some Muslims that I
Yes.
know.
Yeah.
And that really gets at the whole point in what my whole journey was about.
Mhm. Yeah, and I'm glad you touched on a lot of those things towards the end because I had some questions around that. And to your point, my view is when you put the label religion on it, you tend to put it in a box, and it's not something that can be contained within a box. And to your point, also, it is a state of being. And that's something I've had to learn. While I was born into the religion, I had my own struggles in my teenage years and perhaps throughout my 20s because I was looking to people to understand what Islam was rather than looking in myself or looking to the
Mm.
book. And the more awareness and understanding I got, I came to the same conclusion that you did, that it is a state of being. And I think a lot of people misunderstand Islam for that reason. And I think even when people do refer to passages from the Quran and they make statements like, look, it is tribal in the sense that either you're Muslim or you're not. And if you're not, you are to be persecuted. But my view is the Quran is such a beautiful book because you interpreted it based on the state of your heart. So, what would you offer to people who are trying to understand what Islam is? And there's so much information out there. How do you discern between what you're being told and how to form your own opinion?
Mm. You mean like for people who are not Muslim who are trying to understand
Both,
it from,
both. I think because
yeah,
especially growing up in the Western world, for Muslims, I think it's extremely challenging too, because
yeah,
you're growing up in an environment where you're being told what your belief means.
yeah,
At the same time, you're trying to understand what is it really?
yeah. I think for both those people, for both those audiences, and for really everybody, I think that my answer is that people need to, and this is a controversial answer and people could take it the wrong way, but I think people need to put down put aside their relationship to Islam as a religion, because what happens within that is it becomes an idol in and of itself. And then it becomes antithetical to Islam because you're making something of it that it is not.
Right.
And so I think what my answer would be to people is that they should really check in with themselves and orient their compass to what's most important.
Mm.
We can easily say what's most important is Allah, but because some people are not even sure about that and they may have a damaged relationship with God,
Mm.
the answer really has to be is you need to fundamentally prioritize seeking truth.
Mm.
That's what this is about.
Yeah.
And if you point your heart towards being real with yourself and being real with what's real, and that becomes your sole focus, then because I'm so confident that Islam is the way, I believe that that will lead somebody to Islam.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not necessarily what they think Islam is.
Right.
It's the state of Islam. The state of Islam is the state of being, the natural state of the human heart when it is in submission to the real.
Mm-hmm.
And when it is in submission to the real, it is in a state of peace and wholeness.
Mm-hmm.
And if somebody really does that project, from what my experience was, what I found out without trying at all, matter of fact, probably the opposite, I wound up following the religion of Islam because that's aligned with that truth.
Mm-hmm.
And so I really think it needs to, even just now when I said that, I heard Morpheus saying the real, like he in that scene where it like reveals what the actual world looks like, and because the sun has scorched it, it's like the real. And it's like there's something about that matrix where you're like trading in the facade of the comforts of what we think is real
Yes.
for what actually is real, which sometimes is very uncomfortable and unpleasant. But wouldn't you rather have what's actually true than be deluded and living in a facade? And so I think that has to happen to some degree for everybody in order for them to actually really have a true relationship with Islam as it is.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I agree with you. And just to bring back something else you've touched on in different capacity, but is this whole notion of if you take the responsibility of just turning inward and working on yourself, that alone can be a lifelong pursuit. And when you think about physiologically what that means, because in today's world, people are struggling with anxiety or depression. But when you're in that pursuit of, we can say, purifying your soul, but understanding yourself, that is a never ending journey in my mind, because you can never get it perfect. So
Right.
that to me is when people talk about dopamine release, when you're in the pursuit of something productive, that's essentially what's happening. And I've tried to make sense of it in different ways because I often see what's going on around me and it's tough to digest. But when I've read a lot of Imam al-Ghazali's work over the last couple of months, and that was one thing I took out of what he was saying was there's people out there preaching the religion and what Islam is, but ultimately the goal should be turning inward. And that can take a lifetime. So with that being said, how are you then able to find that commonality in terms of psychology in Islam? Because one of the things you've shared is this understanding of turning inward is truly the essence of Islam, right? In a way.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's the essence of what we're here as human beings to do in this life is to come into the recognition, first and foremost, of who we are and what we're here for, and then to give into that, to be in submission to that. And so the process of the human condition or human predicament really is about becoming more human. It seems ironic because aren't we already human? Don't we just need to coast and get out of here alive? That's what most people are trying to do, right?
Yeah.
The reality is none of us are going to get out of here alive. That's the setup. And so while we're here, it's to die before you die, wake up before you die, and live awake in the dream,
Yeah.
be unplugged from the matrix.
Well,
And the
yeah,
only way,
I would argue that I think you have to accept first that you're going to die, because a lot of people are living in denial with that too, right?
yes, yeah, and like they are. And a lot of those people are also people of science and like, where's the proof? And it's nobody else has done it. Nobody else has made it back after they've died.
Yeah.
So we have really good evidence. But I think the turning inward is at the core of what we're here to do, because especially for people who already believe in God, if you already believe in God and you believe that God is one and that God is in control and that God is all knowing and all wise, then people still get stuck on why did he create us? And why is there suffering? And why do I have free will? And none of this makes sense unless you embrace the paradox of these multiple dimensions,
Mm.
that we're here temporarily and that we're here in this temporary situation as a test to see if we can see through the facade. And we're seeing the facade through our external way of being, like
Mm.
our eyes and our physical body and our physical identity and our cultural identity, all the things that we got when we showed up on this material dimension.
Mm-hmm.
But what came with us before we had this material form was this immaterial spiritual being, which still exists within our physicality. And so the only way that we can really access the truth is by accessing our truth.
Mm.
And the only way we can access our truth is by turning inward to connect with the part of us that is eternal,
Yes.
the part of us that's not going to die.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is no way to get out of here, to win this game without self-reflection,
Yes.
because this is the portal for which we can face and submit to the truth through the heart of the human being. Allah says, I do not exist anywhere in my creation except in the heart of my believer.
Mm.
And that doesn't mean that Allah exists in the physical location of the heart. That would be antithetical to Tawheed.
Mm-hmm.
What it means is that heart, your internal heart, your spiritual heart, the qalb, is the portal, is the like secret doorway to connect with that transcendent reality
Yes.
and be in a state of submission. But that state of submission that we can do through that internal self-reflection isn't something you do once and then you get it. It's
Right.
something you have to constantly renew, and which sort of just makes us need to live in a constant state of internal reflection and a constant state of purification so that we can be in a constant state of submission.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you. And I think one of the ways people trip up, and I did when I started questioning my belief system and my relationship with Allah, was we tend to have this transactional relationship, right? So in my naivety, I had this belief that if I do things a certain way, I should get rewarded the way I think I should. And when things didn't happen that way, I felt betrayed in a way. But how do you then, and I guess I've come to realize this through my personal experiences, that at the end of the day, all of these experiences we have is an opportunity for us to work on ourselves and continue to look inward. But where do people get caught up in this transactional relationship because of the misunderstanding we have, right? So what are your thoughts around that?
Like, where is the point where they get caught up in
Yeah.
the external I think it's staying in the matrix. Sorry to keep bringing this as
Yeah.
theme, but people are afraid to face themselves. People are afraid to face the truth, because what does the truth mean? It means you're not in control. That's at the core.
Mhm.
The whole project here is that we have control. We have the setup to make it feel like we're in control, like we have our free will.
Yes.
And that defines our personal identity. Without it, we don't really have much. The whole notion of who we are, if we only identify with our personality and our persona and our individuality, our nafs, then that's defined by our autonomy.
Mhm.
I'm this. I'm going to do this. My goal is to achieve this. I want this for myself. I'm going to try to live longer. All these things are all about trying to control our trajectory. And that is based in a fear of losing. And really, all fear, when you boil it down, is fear of death.
Yes.
And what is it that we're afraid of losing? We're afraid of losing ourself, our self-identity, the notion that I am Abdallah and I exist, right? And so why people have a hard time getting underneath that and really getting to the core of the heart and healing the heart is because when you heal the heart, the healing is fundamentally about giving over yourself to Allah
Mm.
and actually obliterating yourself. And
Mhm.
in a sense, giving over the one thing that you have in your control and submitting that.
Right.
Like the only thing that we have is our free will, right? And our sense of I'm going to do this and I'm going to choose that and I'm not going to choose that and I'm going to create this. And so people, when you're attached to that and that becomes the ground with which you stand on, then everything is based around fearing losing that.
Mhm.
But it's like when I was traveling the world and I was like, I don't have anything to lose. You can take my life, you can take my backpack, you can take my money, and I'll still be with God.
Yeah.
If you have nothing to lose.
Mhm.
And so I think this is what trips people up, is that they're really afraid of losing.
Mhm.
And I think the healing that we need to do is actually letting go and giving up.
Yeah. Yeah, and based on what you're sharing that's where a lot of that freedom comes, right? Because you experience that liberation. You're no longer held back in chains to the material world. That's been my experience. And I think that's a constant exploration because I find myself every day recognizing little things where I'm getting stuck and how can I work through that. Now, there's another thing to understand when we're turning inward, there's also an aspect of shame because we have to accept ourselves as flawed. And that is something Islam also teaches us that yes, we are inherently flawed. And that is the
Yeah.
whole purpose of repentance and constantly seeking Allah's mercy and blessings. But do you see that from a psychological perspective? Because I see this a lot where shame can be so debilitating for people and they'll
Yeah.
go to extreme lengths to avoid shame. And you can see
Yeah.
it manifest in addiction or other forms of behavior that is obviously creating more suffering. But yeah, where do you see that from an Islamic perspective, that ability for to navigate shame? And I think even for Muslims, there's more, I think, from a cultural standpoint, because there's that shame of being judged by
Yeah.
others, right? I'm not praying
Yeah.
5 times a day. I'm experiencing shame now.
I think the core of this is, first of all, this comes from a human a human fault of judgment and shaming,
Mm.
right? Allah does not shame people. Allah, that's not there's none of the 99 names or the shamer. So that's a very human quality. And so unfortunately, many Muslims have been taught their religion by flawed humans,
Mm.
and those flawed humans manipulate the religion, manipulate the Quran, even passages of the Quran, for their own egocentric, nafs oriented need to dominate and control over another person. And that dominance and control produces shame, right? When somebody is dominating and like judging and belittling, then there's shame. And what they do then is they transpose their human flaw by select passages from the Quran and saying, see, Allah is saying that you're going to be punished
Mm.
if you don't do X. Right? So it's completely, not only is it taken out of context for the deeper
It's,
understanding of what that even means, but then it's used when somebody is down in their weak state as a psychological gaslighting maneuver.
mm.
And then what happens is you got all these people whose relationship to Islam is built upon this orientation to it as it was taught by flawed human beings. And they haven't been taught. And then, unfortunately, the people, even when people want to go and learn, they're taught by other people who also have not cleaned their heart.
Yeah.
It used to be that the ulama or the alim was somebody who didn't just memorize books, but that actually had a purified heart.
Mm.
Like you wouldn't be able to be called a sheikh or an alim if you didn't embody the mercy of Allah and the hikmah of Allah. Like there would be no way that an alim could shame somebody. But
Yes.
now that's actually really common.
Yeah.
We got all kinds of people who we see as like the inheritors of the Prophet, astaghfirullah, who are like belittling, shaming, and putting fear into people.
Yeah.
And yet we have this whole tradition of studying the seerah, and everybody knows that we're supposed to look to the Prophet as our representative and we're supposed to follow him, and we look to the Sunnah. And there's not one Sahih Hadith in anybody's minhaj
Yes.
that shows the Prophet shaming anybody.
Right.
Matter of fact, he was extremely merciful
Mhm.
and extremely forbearing and extremely soft and humble. And anybody who has an open heart and goes to Medina can feel it. It's just like you feel accepted in Medina. You
Mhm.
feel like no matter who you are and how many scars you have and how much sins you've done, you're embraced in Medina because this is the energy of the Prophet. And the Prophet would not be like that if his Lord or our Lord wasn't like that. And Allah calls himself before every surah except one, Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim. That out of 99 names, the two he chooses are about mercy.
Yes.
So I think this is the issue: is that the humans, and mostly the Muslim Ummah, really needs a huge recalibration towards mercy rather than wrath.
Yeah. Yes. And what you're sharing there about the teachers, you can easily draw parallels in the field of psychology, right? So if a therapist hasn't done their own inner work, chances are they might have countertransference and they might be triggered by what their clients are sharing. But to have that level of awareness takes quite a bit of work and understanding of yourself. So even when you do feel triggered, you can recognize that, okay, this is mine to take on. This is not my
Right.
client's issue. So how do I hold myself accountable and reflect on this and continue to do my inner work? So do you see those commonalities, and what can Western psychology learn from Islam when it comes to these teachings and understanding of the self?
So much. Yeah, I think that the thing that you just said probably isn't one of the biggest things that they can learn, because there's already in psychology a notion that no therapist can take anybody higher or
Mm.
further than they've gotten themselves. That there is a notion of healer, heal thyself. But the level and the depth of that is possible for both the healer to heal and the healee to be healed is like, we're talking much deeper levels of transformation and transcendence that what I would call actual fundamental healing and transformation, rather than most secular modalities in Western psychology are limited to coping.
Mm.
They're mostly coping strategies. How can I cope with my pain or cope with the trauma? And or how can I reorient my thinking in a way that makes it more adaptive
Mm.
to deal with? Whereas, and that's because there's a limitation to just cognition and behavior, and maybe to some degree emotion, but without a real understanding of where that emotion is coming from and what it's connected to. And so, what Islam offers, not just from Islam, but for humanity to understand psychology, is that the other aspects of the human being, which aren't included in the Western model, which is the qalb, which is like an actual spiritual, metaphysical heart,
Yes.
not just like this pumping blood heart plus emotion, but actually that the heart has this like metaphysical reality of being both in the physical world and the spiritual realm. And that center of the human being, of the heart, of being a spiritual heart, actually has a connection directly to the hikmah of Allah, or
Mm.
consciousness that is beyond just the human being's consciousness, that can actually connect to the transcended truth. And that the ruh, the spiritual essence of the human being a spiritual being that is fundamentally in submission to Allah.
Mm.
And so therefore, that brings this whole other possibility of what's even we're trying to do to get to wholeness and what healing is. And that the goal of healing and the possibility of healing is actually submitting the self to Allah, and in that submission actually being in a state of wholeness, which is what Islam is.
Mm.
When you're a state of being in submission and therefore being at peace because you're in wholeness. And so when we're looking at whole, people often talk about wholeness as a goal of at least holistic health or holistic psychology, but there is no actual framework for understanding what is that wholeness, like what is the actual human being's full picture in its connection, because it's limited to, even if, let's say, somebody who came up with a theory happens to believe in God, if it's in the Western framework of psychology, that sits within the field of science, which has a epistemological bias. And within that field, you're not allowed to consider anything real that is not able to be measured.
Mm.
Otherwise, it's not science, right? That's what people think.
Yes.
So therefore, everything that we're saying is actually the fundamental, most important thing and the core truth of the human being, which is this unseen, transcendent reality. We don't pay attention to that. We're not going to deal with that.
Yes.
So that, all we're left with is moving things around to make it feel better.
Yeah.
So it's coping.
Yeah.
Whereas if we include the qalb and the ruh in the process of healing, we can actually transform, transcend, and submit, which then fundamentally is healing and wholeness, even if symptoms don't go away. And so
Yeah.
it's a very different paradigm and a very different model.
Yes. And speaking of that paradigm, like one of the things you see a lot now is this talk of trauma, which can often fragment one's sense of self. So does this paradigm then help in healing when it comes to trauma?
Mhm.
Because so many people are internalizing that. And where do you draw the line between, from a spiritual sense, leaving it up to God and then taking personal responsibility for your own healing? Because you could see that passive approach too, as well, right? To personal healing.
Yeah. So the first part of that question, the trauma, like you said, people get fragmented
Mm.
because of the trauma. And that fragmentation happens because of lack of integration. So that there's something that they experienced in their sense of themselves as separate. Their individual self had a traumatic experience that tweaked their sense of being, where they weren't able to put it somewhere and integrate it and come back into balance. And so what it did is and so if we don't have a notion of the qalb and the ruh being the fundamental reality of this transcendent connection to the eternal reality of the soul and the sort of being safe and held in Allah's wisdom, then that's why trauma becomes this big problem and this big thing that people are stuck on, is because if you're ignoring these other things, then you're always going to be having this experience of being split or not being able to fully be integrated. And so then trauma-informed therapy essentially becomes what I call more like trauma-averse therapy. And so what we're doing is we're tiptoeing around the trauma because we don't know if the person can handle it, right? We're afraid that if we don't want to say the wrong thing and the person's re-traumatized because maybe they can't handle it, right? And so Allah tells us there's nothing that the human being gets put on them that they can't bear.
Right.
And that doesn't mean we carry it all. It doesn't mean we're supposed to bear it all. It means actually we're supposed to give it all back to the one who's creating it and sustaining us. And so that allows for the trauma to actually be transcended or reintegrated. And that has to happen with the body. So people like Peter Levine or Bessel van der Kolk, who talk about the body keeps the score, they're onto something. They're right. The body is a huge part of how we not only access trauma, but integrate it. But what they're missing is that the body is a dense manifestation of the soul. And so the soul, the ruh, has to be a part of that integration to what we're integrating. First, we have to integrate it into our body so that we can integrate it into our nafs, so that then it can be integrated into the qalb and the ruh, to this spiritual transcendent of we're giving over the trauma. We're actually saying we're giving it to Allah, submitting it and surrendering it, rather than carrying it and coping with it and trying to pack it away in some part of our split psyche.
Yeah. And that's where the other question I had was, can you make the case then that's being passive, saying, I'm just handing it over to God? And
right. That was the second.
Yeah.
No, because we know that there's a lot of people walking around who fundamentally believe in Allah and spend their whole time praying and in dhikr, and are completely not processing not only their trauma, but even just like anything about themselves.
Right.
And that what happens is, so this is spiritual bypassing.
Yes.
Is when we just say, I'm going to just believe in Allah, and I'm going to believe that Allah is going to take it away from me if I just pray more, or do what I'm supposed to do, or I find the right dua to make it all go away, or I'm just going to sit here and wait and pray for Allah to change me. But Allah himself tells us that he does not change a people until they change what is within themselves.
Yes.
So the whole point of this setup as human beings in the dunya is the free will. And that's the thing that people get caught up on. Is, wait, do I have free will or do I trust in Allah?
Yeah.
Do I have free will or do I trust in Allah? Is it my responsibility or do I just give it to Allah? And the whole thing is solved by embracing paradox. It's both and. It's not either or.
Right.
So absolutely, Allah knows everything that's happening. Allah created everything to happen, even your trauma. And Allah is the one who can change that and take it away, and right?
Yes.
But the whole reason why he gives us this life and why we're set up here is to do our part. And our part is simply recognizing that we have to give our will over to Allah. And so that means we fundamentally have to face ourselves. We have to do the internal work. We have to do that inner psychological work. This is where a lot of people get really stuck on, and they're like, I don't believe that. I don't think I believe that. And if you really get down to it, it's because the narrative, it's a mix. A narrative that they've been told is just be a good Muslim.
Right.
You just be a good Muslim, it'll all be worked out. And that's not untrue. That is true. It's just that they don't know what being a good Muslim is. They think it means behaving well, doing the actions that you've been told to do. But being a good Muslim means being in a good state of Islam,
Right.
being in submission. And the only way you can be in submission is if you're in touch with the thing that needs to be submitted, which is the heart. And the heart is the place that everybody's avoiding because that's where the emotional baggage is. That's where the anger is. That's where the envy is. That's where the jealousy is. That's where the pain is. That's where the hurt. That's where the abandonment feels. It all manifests in the heart. But it's also the same place where we need to be in submission. And so the only way you can truly be into submission is to be with what is there in your heart that may be blocking you from being submitted. So, yes, if you can get into a state of full submission and your heart can be unblocked and be in submission, then all you have to do is trust in Allah. But like most of us are not there. And maybe Allah will put you there, but you don't sit around waiting for Allah to favor you that way. You fundamentally have to do your part. And this is what you're reading Ghazali, this is what his whole premise is. And all of the scholars talk about Riyadat al-Nafs. Riyadat al-Nafs is like the work that we need to do on our nafs to face ourselves and to fundamentally change what is within ourselves.
Yes, absolutely. And your inner state will then determine how your external actions are coming out to be.
And it can go the other way around. It's not to say we should mimic the Prophet's behaviors, but it's like in order to get you going on the right track. But you can't just stop there because we know of a lot of people who mimic the Prophet's external behaviors and they're horrible people. Like they have anger and they're not at all prophetic in their character. So it doesn't just go that way. Like you can do the external things and then inshallah, if you're reflecting at the same time, it can illuminate the inner character.
I do want to come back to your framework because you've touched on it in so many ways. So just talking through some of the terms you've used, whether it's the nafs, which is basically an aspect of ourself or our ego, and then I'll touch on the other ones, but there's this belief, especially in a lot of the Eastern philosophies and traditions, that kind of this notion that you have to dispense with your ego, but the ego does serve a purpose, right? And what we've come to understand is it is changing, right? Determined by what is driving your attention. So if you're attending to base desires, that will be a reflection of your ego versus where you're at peace, which is something you've talked about. Are you able to shed some light on the nafs and this whole notion of the ego from an Islamic perspective and in the framework that you talk about?
Yeah, the nafs is not inherently bad. It's not something that we need to like get rid of the nafs or kill the nafs, because that would be essentially getting rid of ourselves. Like we that is who we are. It's who we are here in this dimension. And the best way that we can understand this, or how we can understand that the nafs isn't necessarily the bad thing, it's that the nafs has a tendency. The nafs tendency is to go against ourselves or be the thing that trips us up, to stay with the veil, stay with the material world, stay in the matrix. But if we look at the terminology, even Allah tells us in the Quran, talks about the nafs al-lawama and the nafs al-mutmainna. Now, these aren't different nafs. It's not like you have multiple personality disorder and you're walking around with like multiple nafs. They're different states of the same nafs. So the same nafs that you have, the same nafs being the sense of yourself is separate. Self that we usually talk about.
Right.
Because usually we're not talking about the ruh, unfortunately. We're only talking about, I'm this guy from this place and I like these things and I have this career and I'm emotional about these type of things.
Yes.
So the nafs al-amara bil-su is the nafs that has the tendency to be inclined towards, some people say evil, but really it's not evil in the sense of like fundamental evil, but it could literally just mean like in the sense of like turning away from Allah, like forgetfulness or heedlessness,
Yes.
forgetting your true nature. And so the same nafs has the tendency to forget and to be heedless, but it also has the ability to be in a state of lawama, which is taking itself into account, having some self-responsibility, recognizing that I need to do the work on myself to purify myself and not just sit around waiting for Allah to do it.
Mhm.
And then nafs al-mutmainna is this nafs when it's at rest, it's at peace, it's reflecting the reality of the ruh that is in submission to Allah. And the nafs still is a separate self, right? Is a sense of ourselves as separate because it's fundamentally what we have as long as we're embodied human beings in this world. But we can elevate and purify the nafs so that it can be beautiful and it's actually the vehicle with which we can fully realize and witness Allah.
Yes.
So there's nothing, we can't do this without the nafs. The goal is not to get rid of the nafs. People say there is terminology, particularly in tasawwuf literature, of like fana,
Right.
or annihilation of the nafs, right? Or people will say step on your nafs or kill your nafs. And those are metaphorical ways of saying discipline your nafs.
Yes.
Don't let it take control of you.
Mm-hmm.
But it's beautiful. The nafs is us. It's our soul. Like there isn't translation of nafs that you can say it means the soul, right? And this is what people get confused on, is because we're trying to understand these things, nafs, aql, qalb, ruh, and we're trying to understand them from a linear, rational place where we think in parts. Allah's reality is tawheed, it's unity, it's unicity. We just have a hard time. Anytime we use our thinking mind, we think in parts and pieces because that's about the material dimension. And so anytime you're like, is it this or that? That's having to do with our material reality because nothing is this or that. Everything is multidimensional.
Yes. And you can be in different states depending on the situation and context too, right? Like you can
Right.
experience a different state when you're at work and a different state
Oh,
with
yeah.
your family. So again, it's that
We go through, the nafs fluctuates like more than 40 times a day easily, like maybe even in the hundreds. Like you can be in nafs al-mutmainna in one moment when you're in the woods, and then suddenly you get a phone call and you're back in nafs al-amara bil-su. Like it's that tenuous,
yes.
which is why it positions us to always constantly be in the moment, to be ibn al-waqt, to be a son or daughter of the moment,
Yeah.
and to be constantly in a state of remembering Allah, because you never are stationed anywhere until you die. That's the whole point. It's like we hope and we pray that we die in that best state. But it's possible you can be in your best state and then drop to a really low state. And that's why we always want to just be constantly engaged in the turning, not the accomplishing.
Right.
It's not about obtaining our best state.
Mm-hmm.
It's about, as long as you're remembering and turning to Allah, that's your best state. That's fundamentally your best state. Even if you've just immediately done the worst thing you've ever done in your life, in the split second that you ask for forgiveness to Allah or turn to Allah, you're immediately in the highest state you could possibly be, even higher than had you been in this state of nafs al-mutmainna, but from the state of nafs al-mutmainna, for a split second, not been in a state of turning to Allah.
Yes. Yeah. And again, it re-emphasizes everything we've talked about thus far, is turning inward and really understanding yourself to know which situations bring out the worst in you, so you can continuously be in
You have to study yourself and know what your triggers are, know what you need to do your homework on yourself. He who knows himself knows his Lord. That's the meaning of that. We have to study ourselves to know, oh, here we go again. There's my nafs flaring up. I better be on my best, be disciplined. And this is what Ramadan is about, training us to be able to refine our self-control.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And moving on to the heart, because you've talked about the qalb, and I think you've touched on it, but it's really the idea of our moral compass, and our spiritual state can determine the condition of our heart. Is there anything else to elaborate on that from your perspective when it comes to understanding our heart and the purity of it?
Yeah, so much. I think the heart is such a dynamic and mysterious thing. We have these heart emojis, and I find it funny that, like, I've worked with a lot of people and trying to get them to get in touch with their heart, and they'll get stuck. And I don't even know what that means to get in touch with my heart. All I can do is I just see a heart emoji. I see this shape of this flat red shape of this love heart. And what we need to do a lot more in terms of educating ourselves, but also on an experiential level, is experiencing the subtle nature of the heart and the subtle dimensions of the heart. The heart has many different layers. And like everything has in Arabic, they say like everything seven, they're always referencing seven layers, right?
Mhm.
Seven dimensions. But in Arabic, seven means like multiple. There's the qira'at, right? The seven qira'at of the Quran,
Yes.
and what each one of them aren't just like nice different ways to sing. They actually reveal different dimensions of how you can read the same ayah,
Mhm.
because it's all this murabit. There's these different dimensions of reality. And so the heart is this amazing thing that lives in all of these dimensions at the same time. Like your jism, your body in and of itself, the material form, only lives in the material realm. However, because it's infused with the soul, the body takes on the intelligence and perception of the heart. And so the body can actually has intelligence and can perceive beyond the material world because it's infused with the soul, right? Infused with the ruh, infused with the yakiluna, right? The function, the perception. But that is all a function of the heart. The heart has the ability to perceive things as they are. And so it's because its nature of being occupying these different dimensions. So you have the sadr, which is the outer chest area that is, Allah says, it's not the eyes that go blind, but the heart's
Yes.
in the chest, in the sadr, right? But the sadr is like the front facing material dimension of the heart. And that's how we access it. So we fundamentally have to access our qalb in the chest here. Like when the Prophet said, Astafti qalbak, consult your heart, he went like this. He touched his chest.
Mhm.
And so what that does is it connects us to this way of entering into the qalb. But there's different layers. So there's the sadr, there's the lub, there's the qalb, and then if you go all the way into the depths, there's the sir, which is the secret, meaning we can't even know. It's not even possible. It's this mystery of Allah.
Mhm.
To bring that home is the heart is something that we all need to spend a lot more time centering our notion of self and being in. And without that, we're going to have a very hard time understanding the work that we need to do for healing. We're going to have a very hard time understanding how to really make sense of who we are. And we're going to have a very hard time actually being Muslim or actually entering into a state of Islam, because it's the heart that needs to be submitted. And it's the heart that has these blockers to submission.
Mhm.
And those blockers are resulting from our experiences in the dunya.
Yes.
And those very much are our psychological hangups, our patterns, our trauma. And so they're not different from the spiritual work. The self work is spiritual work.
Yes. Yes. And you're seeing a manifestation of that in the world today, especially if you think about all the wars that are taking place, all the hate. That is essentially a projection of the condition of people's heart. Right? So that's something I constantly reflect on too. And then moving forward with the Ruh, as you've talked about the spirit, that's essentially the divine essence. And you constantly think about what we're told is basically when Allah says, we are closer to you than your jugular vein. That is
Mm.
so profound. but we don't fully comprehend that. And it is hard to comprehend because, again, going back to what you said with science, if you can't see it, if you can't explain it, then it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's the question?
I was just gonna ask, is there anything else to add on that piece with the ruh before we move on to the intellect and the akal?
So I think a lot of people will say there's this ayah in the Quran that says little is known about the ruh, right? And people think that means we don't know anything about it. And so it's this big mystery. And so therefore, don't even touch it. We're just going to ignore it, basically. First of all, what that means is, well, there's many, like everything, there's different ways we can understand that. On one level, it's little is known about the ruh, but the ruh is so deep and so mysterious and so profound that like that little bit that we do know will last us a lifetime of, it's all we need to know. And there's no way we'll ever get to the end of even that little bit. But you could also read it as saying little of us know of the depths of the ruh.
Yes.
And so really my position on this is that if we decide, because we don't know much about it, we're gonna keep that mysterious and we're gonna ignore the ruh, then we're really just like blind men trying to describe an elephant. Like we don't have the whole picture. Like that's fundamentally the most important part of who we are. And so we better not only acknowledge it and fundamentally stand in that as our true identity, but really we should be spending more time delving into it as an actual reality of our being, and we carry it around with us. And most people talk about it as, oh, the only way to like deal with the ruh is you pray, you do this. And so people, like in my field of Islamic psychology, some people say ruhani sort of interventions are prayer and fasting and reading Quran. So we connect it to like worship, which makes sense, right? Because those things absolutely, definitely nourish the ruh.
Yes.
But they're, from a psychological standpoint, in an empowering aspect, it's really just, those are behaviors. Those are more behavioral than they are spiritual.
Yes.
In the sense of like prescriptiveness. And so I think what we need to do is see ourselves fundamentally as spiritual beings having a human experience rather than human beings having a spiritual experience, like the French philosopher said.
Yes.
And so I just think that needs to come into the picture when we are talking about not only psychology, but understanding our Muslim identity should fundamentally and foremost be understanding us as spiritual beings, as a ruh.
And I think that's definitely something I've seen, even when you think about the transpersonal psychology framework too, is the cognitive piece can only get you so far. And then often people are looking for what's next and often they're not able to connect to that spiritual side.
Yeah.
And
that, like, even just to bring it around to where we started on like my whole journey and like what I was looking for of what is the common denominator. And it's the ruh that makes us every human being on this planet is a ruh.
Yes.
Regardless of where they're from or what religion they believe in, or if they believe in a religion or if they believe in God, they still fundamentally are this spiritual being.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And so I think that's both where we need to focus the healing for ourselves and for our understanding of Islam, but where we need to focus the healing of the world right now is that this is what we have in common. This is the most important thing that makes us human.
Yes. Yes. And unfortunately, we are so divided to, probably a conversation for a different day. But the last part around the akal and the intellect, and I see so many people get stuck just in this piece, but there's a deeper aspect to it, which is wisdom. And wisdom is not something that you just have. To me, it's something that you acquire through life experiences and knowledge and different situations you go through. But from this framework and your perspective, how does this fit in with the other three? Because like I said, I find most people get stuck on this piece and then they only function from the intellect.
Yeah. And that's just a result of the contemporary times that we live in that are very cognitive focused. And this comes from like the cognitive revolution. It comes from the postmodernist,
Mhm.
secular modernity that defines things in material dualism.
Yeah.
And so that dualist position really orients us to the mind, sorting everything out through the mind, and like this intellectualization of everything and rational proofs. And it really, even though that's a huge part of the Islamic tradition, is rational proofs and logic, and it's it has its place as a tool, and you're only really supposed to use that as a tool when you're already firmly standing on the spiritual reality and the reality of marifa, that you can actually know by your heart being purified and open, that the heart can receive knowledge.
Mhm.
And that receiving of knowledge through ilham transcends rational proofs fundamentally. That's what it means. And so it's all about balance. It's all about honoring multiple dimensions. People seem to have forgotten to know how to do that because of the whole renaissance of removing the sacred from the mundane.
Yeah.
It used to be that, like, regardless of what theological framework you came from, there was just a human acceptance of God
Mhm.
being in the world. And Nietzsche declared that God was dead.
Yeah.
And even Muslims since then seem to have fallen for that trap, that even though they talk about God, they really only talk about God from a material, logical, rational standpoint.
Right.
And they have cut themselves off from this this transcendence that is immanent, the transcendence that actually exists within the material.
Mhm.
That is something we need to understand when we understand the aql, is that Ghazali talked about the aql as having different levels.
Yes.
That there is aql, there is the brain function of rational. That's very important. We need that to understand revelation. But then we understand that revelation, and the whole idea is that it's supposed to then illuminate the heart. You're
Mhm.
not supposed to just stop at the cognitive function of understanding. That's a doorway to actual thick. Thick means deep understanding, which can only happen if the heart is open and softened.
Yes.
So this is just a function. This is very, I would call it like un-Islamic. And some people are triggered by that because Islam is a very intellectual tradition, and that's absolutely true. But it's always been in balance, and that's balance is missing.
Yeah. Yeah. And that imbalance, I think, often leads one to then start worshiping their own intellect.
Yeah,
And that's,
yeah,
and we've seen a lot of consequences
yeah. Like
of that.
we put scholars on pedestals based on the amount of text that they've memorized rather than the character or the purity of their heart.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And again, everything we've touched on today, it all comes back to understanding yourself. And that's probably the deepest exploration one can go on. But Dr. Rothman, thank you so much for your time today, your wisdom, sharing your story, and everything you were able to talk about. Thank you so much for being gracious with your time. I really appreciate it. Final thing I ask all guests, if there's anyone interested in learning more about your work, what are some ways they can do that? How can they find your stuff online? They're not
Yeah,
familiar with it.
sure. I do have a website that's just abdullahrothman.com. It has all my publications and videos and events and stuff like that. That's just like my work, a lot of the intellectual work. But the project that I'm most spending my time on, where there's the most sort of activity both in the world of healing, but also well-being and self-help, is Dar al-Shifa. So this is online, and it's dar-al-shifa with two A's.com. And we have online courses. We also have online counseling, and we do retreats. And we also have accessible resources for people to do Islamically oriented guided meditation and practice. And so this is where I'm doing a lot of the work of developing I did a lot of work in the theory of Islamic psychology, and now I'm really focusing on putting that into practical application through healing method. So I'm about to release a book on the method of therapy that I've developed from my research. And yeah, so Darul Shifa is where people can find me.
Okay. Amazing. I'll put all of that in the show notes. But thank you again and enjoy the rest of your Ramadan and hope to stay connected with you.
Inshallah. Thank you for having me, and Ramadan Mubarak.